Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On the program this week, how the U.S. is handling the coronavirus, new travel ban restrictions take effect, and how a small story on flooding at the border wall uncovers a much larger problem. All that's just ahead. But before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. Here with me today, as always, are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Hey, Jordan.
The world continues to closely monitor the situation in China and elsewhere as Chinese officials struggle to contain the spread of the Wuhan coronavirus. As a small but growing number of cases are beginning to be reported outside China, including a handful in the United States, many governments and businesses are taking steps to quarantine, limit travel, and isolate against the illness. Here to give us a sense of the U.S. response and the immigration angle to the story is Dr. Anand Parekh. He's Chief Medical Advisor here at BPC. Hi, Anand.
Hi, Jordan.
So let's start, if we could, with a more detailed update on the state of play with the coronavirus epidemic. Where do things stand right now?
Sure. It's a pretty serious issue, Jordan. Anytime you have a novel virus that humans don't have immunity to, and in this case, this particular strain of coronavirus was jumped from the animal population to the human population, and now we're seeing essentially human-to-human transmission of that virus. So whenever you see a novel virus that is transmitted from a human-to-human host, you get concerned. And we believe over the last 6 weeks, at least in terms of confirmed cases, that there are about 25,000 cases of this coronavirus. Nearly 500 people have died. Now, 99% of the cases have been in China. Virtually all the deaths have also been in China. So China is really facing an epidemic of this novel coronavirus. However, there have also been nearly 25 countries now that have reportedly had cases of the coronavirus, a couple of deaths as well. 11 cases here in the United States, 9 of which were travel-related, so they came back from China. 2 cases where it was a close family member, so there's some human-to-human transmission. But this is a serious issue.
So a number of U.S. airlines have canceled flights to China indefinitely, and my understanding is that many businesses throughout China are also shutting down. So you get a sense of some of the private action, but how have the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the U.S. government responded from a public health perspective?
Yeah, so the World Health Organization has called now this novel coronavirus a public health emergency of international concern. It's not quite a pandemic. A pandemic, by definition, would be really an epidemic in multiple continents across the globe. What we're seeing is really an epidemic in China with cases throughout the world. But it is of grave concern, and that's why they have issued that statement. Here in the United States, the Health and Human Services Secretary has declared a public health emergency. The president has put forward a proclamation related to travel restrictions, which we'll get to. But this is really all hands on deck across the world of trying to identify cases, isolate cases, ensure they get treatment, and then do contact tracing of potentially individuals who are exposed, quarantining individuals to make sure that they don't have the virus. So a lot of really detailed detective public health work ongoing. Anytime, Jordan, you have a new virus, a vaccine is really the best intervention. Unfortunately, getting a vaccine ready, manufacturing a vaccine takes many, many months. It probably takes 6 to 12 months, and then you have to distribute it and deliver it. So that's going to take a lot of time. So until then, it's all about good, solid public health. It's about surging the medical system to make sure that they are prepared. It's looking at the supply chain, all the different things you might need in terms of protective personal equipment. All of that is taking place not just here in the United States, but really all across the world.
So let's get into some of those travel issues. This epidemic comes at the height of the Lunar New Year, where billions of trips are taken every year, both within Asia and around the world. And in fact, it's the world's largest travel event. So given that, what travel restrictions has the U.S. government imposed?
Yeah. So there's a lot we don't know yet. So there are a couple of issues. One is the severity. So if there are 25,000 cases, about 500 deaths, so that's essentially a mortality rate of 2%. Now, many, and I'm in this camp, also think that's probably an overestimate. There are probably tenfold or several-fold more cases, probably more deaths as well, but probably the mortality rate is going to come down. But that's still, a lot of people, if a lot of people end up getting the virus, it's a lot of people dying. So I think severity is one factor. Transmission, exactly how easily is this transmitted? We're learning about that as well. It looks like it's more easily transmitted than the flu, but less than perhaps SARS or measles, or so there's maybe in the intermediate category there. And then we're also learning about the incubation period, and what that means is for how many days might you have the virus without you having symptoms. And that's important for multiple reasons. The virus may be transmitted during that time, but it's also important in terms of from a travel perspective. If you're trying to contain the outbreak and identify cases and do contact tracing, all that information is what you need to know. So a lot of variables here. The science is coming in not just daily, it's coming in hourly from folks really around the world.
So, Theresa, I want to bring you in here to talk a little bit more about how those restrictions are being implemented and whether they're likely to be effective in the long run.
So the implementation comes as a partnership between HHS and CBP, Customs and Border Protection, who operates the ports of entry, as well as the airlines and travel companies. So when HHS makes this declaration, and again with the presidential proclamation, what CBP does then is start looking at incoming flights and the manifests that the airlines are transmitting to identify individuals who have in their travel itinerary a travel to China. And so that's the indication they have. They get advanced passenger information from the airlines. They would identify people on that flight who may have had travel in China or from China that would be subject to the travel restrictions. At that point, then they notify the airline, and if it's somebody who is prevented from travel, the airline would tell them that they're not permitted to travel. If it's somebody who is permitted to travel, then CBP would arrange for HHS or other health officials to meet that flight and address those individuals as they land in terms of the quarantine and what needs to be done. The differentiation between U.S. citizens and foreign nationals, frankly, is that the United States doesn't have authority really to bar United States citizens from coming back home. So we do have the authority to bar foreign nationals from coming in, and so distinctions have to be made in how you treat those populations. But it really is a partnership between the travel companies, the airlines, and CBP and HHS. The other thing I would say, though, is that in terms of the travel histories, they're trying to identify people who've been to China within the last 2 weeks. And they may not have traveled on one single travel itinerary. It may not be a single travel itinerary there and back. They may have had separate travel itineraries. That can be a difficulty in identifying people who might be subject to the travel restrictions. So at that point, they're relying on people to voluntarily tell them. And so the airlines will be asking passengers, have you been in China or have you been near somebody who's been in China for the last 2 weeks, to then identify them as possibly being subject to the restrictions.
And on the question about whether or not these restrictions or precautions are likely to be effective.
And I might start, Jordan, with China, because they have right now, supposedly, quote unquote, on lockdown, tens of millions of people in Wuhan and Hubei province in essentially a lockdown because they are trying to contain the outbreak and now epidemic within China. But I think the central point here, Jordan, is microbes know no borders. There's no way, there's no fail-safe way really to you can try to stop it, and you can postpone it, you can deter it, but it's very, very difficult to contain a virus just through sort of broad travel restrictions. The reason why you might do some of this is really to buy time for the public health system to do its work, for the healthcare system to do its work, for researchers to come up with the vaccines and treatments that are necessary. So in the United States, back to your question, last Friday, the Health and Human Services Secretary issued a public health emergency. President Trump issued a proclamation. And essentially, there are several pieces of this, and I'm sure Theresa will get into this more, but there are three I think, critical aspects. The first is, if you're a U.S. citizen and you've been in Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak in Hubei province in China, and you are coming back to the United States, you will be quarantined, and it's mandatory for 14 days. Why 14 days? That's thought of as the incubation period of the virus. Public health authorities want to make sure that there isn't somebody here harboring the infection. They don't have symptoms, but they then develop overt symptoms and pass it on. So it's mandatory quarantining. That is either done at U.S. military bases, or states right now are identifying hotels and other areas where individuals can be housed. The second group of people are U.S. citizens coming back from China other than from Hubei province or Wuhan, so other parts of China. There, those individuals are being asked to voluntarily quarantine for 14 days. So they can go home, but there will be some follow-up, and they're then being asked to monitor their symptoms and seek medical care and attention and alert public health authorities if they develop essentially respiratory-like symptoms. And then there's a third category for those individuals who are foreign nationals, with the exception of spouses of U.S. citizens or permanent residents. But if you're a foreign national and you're coming to the United States and you've been in China for the last 14 days, you will not be allowed to enter the United States. And essentially, so those are the three larger buckets. And I'll just make just a couple of comments on those restrictions. First is that the right call is a question that I'm asked a lot, and there's no right answer for that, right? There's a very precise calibration going on here. On one hand, you want to make sure that there aren't more and more cases in the United States, even though there are going to be, but you want to try to reduce the number. On the other hand, you don't want to do something that's not evidence-based. So there's a calibration here. And the idea here is that if you have a travel restriction, again, that is nuanced, it's precise, it's adaptable, and if it's communicated well, that you can reduce the number of cases, buy time for the preparedness and response activities here in the United States. So that's really the underlying reason for the travel restriction.
All right, Dr. Anand Parekh, thanks for being here. When we come back, Travel Ban 4.0. The travel restrictions on people arriving from China aren't the only limits the Trump administration has imposed on the arrival of foreign nationals since we last talked. The administration unveiled the fourth version of the so-called travel ban, President Trump's first major immigration policy, which generated a protracted wave of litigation. And as with the prior iterations, the new travel ban prohibits the entry of citizens from specific countries. But this ban adds a new wrinkle, limiting those from certain countries from accessing either immigrant visas or diversity visas. So, Cris, who is on the growing list of countries affected by this travel ban?
So the travel ban is now being extended to a whole new set of countries from different global regions. The complete list is Kyrgyzstan, Myanmar, Eritrea, Nigeria, Sudan, and Tanzania. And what's interesting about this is obviously this travel ban, and Theresa will go into this a little bit more detail, is kind of a complement or an extension of Travel Ban 3.0. And when we say that, it's because they're actually starting to limit, immigrant and non-immigrant visas from these countries. Now, it's not universal of how this is applied. Nationals from Kyrgyzstan, Myanmar, Eritrea, and Nigeria can't access immigrant visas. And what's interesting is that Sudan and Tanzania can access immigrant visas through the diversity visa program. And this is pretty interesting because over the last couple of years, you've been seeing the Trump administration really lambast the diversity visa program, kind of saying it's a lottery and not really noting that the program actually is rigorously screened for individuals who are going to enter. But, what else is really significant from this is that Nigeria was targeted. I think that's the largest source of immigrants from Africa. It's one of the largest economies in Africa, and immigration advocates have been really trying to press the case that these are some of the best integrated and some of the most productive immigrants that we have in the United States. So that's kind of the broader issue. But I think Theresa obviously can talk about how this is very much in line with 3.0.
Sure. So let's go back to the beginning. The first travel ban 1.0 was issued on January 27th, 2017, right after the president took office. It was immediate implementation. It was from many, many more countries, and it was all travel from those countries. It created mass chaos at the airports. There were several lawsuits filed. The president issued a revised travel ban after a first set of court decisions said that they thought the first travel ban was overbroad, and that after that litigation, there came Travel Ban 3.0, which was the one that eventually went to the Supreme Court. The main differences among these was that as each iteration of the travel ban was released, there was increasing detail in the level of rationale and the security nexus for these changes. So getting more and more away from the idea that it's a Muslim ban, which the president had called for during the campaign, and trying to legitimize it more on actual security grounds. The main thing is that Travel Ban 3.0 included an actual process by which Department of Homeland Security and State Department went to countries around the world and evaluated them on specific criteria. Those criteria included the security of their travel documents, their passports. Were they machine readable? Were they biometric? How well did they validate the identity of people who were using those passports? And how well could the United States or other countries validate those passports against the country's records? How well was the country sharing information with the United States about criminal activity or terrorist activity that may be applying in their nation? And last but not least, would that country accept its nationals back if we remove them? So those were some of the security criteria that were part of the Travel Ban 3.0 analysis. And that travel ban was the one the Supreme Court ultimately upheld and said, under these conditions, there is a sufficient justification and the president has the authority. That same rubric was used for this version of the travel ban. As a matter of fact, there's a lengthy explanation in the presidential document of the reviews that were made country by country. There are allusions to, without naming them, countries that might have made the list but were taken off for one reason or another. But as Cris said, the final list of countries was deemed to be necessary to take action against, according to the document, based on the fact that they just did not meet some basic levels of these criteria.
Cris, I want to come back to something you said about the subset of countries who are barred, the nationals of which are barred from seeking immigrant visas or diversity visas. Advocates are saying this is just another effort to limit migration from developing nations. So, Cris, who is on the growing list of countries affected by this travel ban?
So as Theresa was saying, in terms of the goal, the administration was really looking at a lot of national security issues in order to justify restricting these the arrival of these nationals from these countries. Like I said, Nigeria in particular is obviously one of the largest sources of immigrants. You also have Eritrea, another African country, as well as Tanzania and Sudan. And when you're looking at this, advocates kind of looked at this and said, this is a direct targeting of immigrants from Africa. And they kind of have been pointing to President Trump, his comments at, I think it was December 2018 about, I can't use the language on this podcast, but he kind of disparaged countries from Latin America and Africa. And they've been saying that this is sort of in line with his policy of trying to enact, in their own words, not in mine, a racist policy. And this is happening within the context of the administration really trying to clamp down on the arrival of immigrants who may be low-income immigrants. Over the last couple of months, we've seen the public charge rule. We've seen the executive order issued by the president that requires, individuals who want to get a green card to have health insurance. Immigrant advocates are kind of lumping this in there. But I think, as Theresa said, I think it is worth noting that this was already in Travel Ban 3.0, this whole notion of trying to restrict the entry of individuals with who want to get green cards, that this has already been in the cards for a while. So I think when you're trying to assess those claims that this is just simply trying to restrict immigration, I think the timing of it kind of feeds into this. I think it's been the fact is that 3.0 already had this in place. maybe that might have been anticipating this in the long run, what's being done. But I really do think this is more about timing and less so intention.
Yeah, I think the other thing that it bears noting is that one of the other main differences between Travel Ban 3.0 and this one is that none of these countries are being restricted from non-immigrant visas, from tourists, from working, from studying, just from immigrant permanent visas. And that is different from the last version of the travel ban. The last version of the travel ban for each of the countries named, yes, it limited immigrant visas, but it also, to some extent or another, limited non-immigrant visas, particularly tourist visas, which are the largest number of visas issued to anybody from around the world. We have more tourist visas than anything else that enters anyone else that enters the United States. So if your concern is security, there are a couple things to bear in mind. First of all, immigrants are screened and vetted much more thoroughly than non-immigrants are when coming to the United States. In order to get an immigrant visa, you must go through a full, thorough biometric background check, have your fingerprints taken. You have to go through a police record check in your home country in every place you have lived, as well as if you've ever lived in the United States. Most immigrants to the United States are coming because they already have a relationship with a person or an organization in the United States. They're being sponsored by a family member or they're being sponsored by an employer. So there is a tie already to the United States. Many, many non-immigrants don't have that, particularly tourists and business visitors. So there is a very big question. If your security is your rationale and you're concerned about our immigration system being used primarily by terrorists, which is how this is being labeled, preventing terrorist entry to the United States, why are you not also limiting temporary visas from these countries? Why focus in on immigrant visas? And in particular, for two of the countries, only on immigrant visas issued as part of the diversity visa program, which the president has disparaged specifically, has said needs to be eliminated. He calls it an un-American lottery system. He has repeatedly indicated his desire to get rid of the diversity visa program, which he can't do unless Congress legislates it. So targeting that particular program for a couple of these countries is also sort of in line with the rhetoric that he had. But just going back to the strictly security grounds. Now, what the proclamation says is that one of the reasons they're restricting immigrant visas and not non-immigrant visas is that immigrants are more difficult to remove if they are later found to be terrorists. Well, that is true, that immigrants have more rights and are entitled to a hearing before an immigration judge before being removed. But frankly, most non-immigrants already here also are eligible to have their case decided by an immigration judge if they so choose to do so. So it's not entirely clear how strong that rationale is, especially given all the other factors that I said, that most immigrants are screened and vetted more thoroughly before they come here. And so if we've made a mistake in that vetting and someone comes in the United States who has ill intent, that's a problem with the vetting, not necessarily the country. So I think that there are lots of open questions about that relationship and the fact that there aren't non-immigrants targeted on this. The other thing I would be remiss if I didn't mention is that all of the countries under Travel Ban 3.0 are still covered by a travel ban. This new proclamation does not remove any of the prior restrictions. It only adds to.
So then the big question, will this travel ban be challenged in court?
Oh, probably. I can't see why it wasn't. And the fact is that even though the Supreme Court upheld Travel Ban 3.0, there are still aspects of that travel ban that are still being litigated. For example, the travel ban does have some exemptions and waivers, theoretically, in the travel ban that says under certain conditions, even if you're subject to the ban, you might be able to come in. There's ongoing litigation about whether and how those exemptions are actually being used and authorized, and whether or not anybody's able to actually access those exemptions. So there's ongoing litigation out there already. I think what makes it a little bit challenging is that the Supreme Court decision in Travel Ban 3.0 did seem to say that as long as the administration has a facially valid security justification, whether or not there are also ulterior motives, such as eliminating the diversity program or limiting immigration from African countries, it's not necessarily going to prevent this from being a lawful exercise of authority. And given that, it's an interesting question to see how successful subsequent litigation will be. But There are a lot of clever lawyers out there that are probably working on it right now and trying to figure out how to do it.
All right, after the break, will floodwaters sink the border wall? Late last month, the Washington Post reported that the wall being constructed at the southwest border will require hundreds of storm gates to prevent flash floods from dragging debris that could damage the wall's foundation or even cause it to collapse in heavy rains. This came after some widely shared pictures of temporary barriers felled by rain. So how substantial is this problem? Is it something that affects the parts of the wall that have already been constructed?
So right now, what the Post was reporting is that this is a problem that's not come up during the construction process. And the reporter, Nick Miroff, was talking about how he was visiting parts of the border in Arizona and kind of noted I love the imagery of this, that there was almost like gaps in teeth where government contractors have not built sections of the wall that were over creeks or riverbeds or something like that, where they hadn't really found a way to sort of deal with this problem. It's just kind of there. And so that's kind of where the issue is right now, that this has sort of come up. I think it's worth noting that, Congress did allow DHS and the government to sort of waive the environmental requirements for building the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. So this is less so of a legal issue, more of just something sheer in logistics and construction, that this is now a problem that they're encountering, and they're trying to find a way to sort of deal with it. So I think that that's the way of thinking about this, is that this has come up. It's a deal that they're, it's an issue that they're dealing with right away. And it's an issue that CBP has dealt with in terms of existing structures that are already in place. They do have to sort of open those gates to be able to allow water to come through. And one of the things is that, during the monsoon season in the summer, there are a lot of torrential rains that can bring a lot of debris, and that requires a lot of sort of response from government agencies to be able to deal with this. So that's sort of the more logistical components.
Obviously, the goal of the wall is to try to stop illegal border crossings. Is this problem going to affect the wall's ability to do so?
So I think the short answer is no wall will permanently stop all illegal immigration. I think we need to recognize that. There have been also multiple stories already of sections of the new wall where the bollards have been cut or bent away or other damage, and people have managed to find a way through, ladders climbing over. There is no such thing as a wall that will stop all illegal immigration. We need to just state that full stop. But one of the things that is clear is that to deal with this problem, there will have to be openings left in the wall. And any place there is an opening, yes, there is a possibility that people will come through. We've already seen it at the border. We know that migrants are, traversing dangerous rivers, the Rio Grande, and have died trying to come to the United States. So any potential opening is a potential where migrants can come through. And again, it's a place where Border Patrol will have to continually monitor these sections of wall that are left open, so that the debris and other things won't collapse the wall. And so I think the main reason this is such a big story is the way that the president has talked about the wall. He has talked about it as an impenetrable wall. He's talked about it as a wall that will stop all illegal immigration. And the more we see about the reality of building along the border, the more you understand that kind of vision just really isn't feasible.
So is the government, though, up to the task of building this wall in such a geographically diverse and such a challenging area? You've highlighted, I think, very effectively the range of challenges. Can the government handle this?
Well, look, I have a lot of faith in the Army Corps of Engineers who are designing and building this wall. But what I will say is, I've seen this many times before, there's not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, the fact that they have come up with this particular design, and this is the design the president wants, may not be the design that actually works at every place along the border. And you may have to have alternatives to an actual barrier in certain places where having a barrier can't stand the terrain, right? As Cris mentioned, the issue here is not one from the government's perspective of, oh my goodness, this will cause flooding and damage to wildlife and preservation. No, it's if debris and water gets locked up against the base of the wall and the foundation, it will erode the foundation and the wall will fall down. And they don't want that. So, and they will have to work to clear away the debris every time it happens. It may also back up onto land adjacent to and impact roads and other things. So it's clearly a construction logistic issue. But what it means is that the decisions that were made about where walls should be placed had to be based on the terrain, and alternatives such as sensors or having more Border Patrol agents in the region may actually be the necessary effective deterrent or prevention mechanism rather than a physical structure of this type in those locations.
Yeah, I mean, the United States has two of the longest land barriers with a country, the longest one in the world with Canada, and the 10th longest one with Mexico. And you're looking at Mexico, that is the 10th longest land border in the world with another country. And so you're going to be covering a lot of terrain over that. And they think, that I think Theresa's been right, that the way that the president's been talking about this, that this is going to be one continuous wall, is now starting to come across some very real geographic limitations on really how that can be done. So that's the key point, is that, there's a lot to deal with.
All right, Cris, Theresa, that's a good place to leave it. Thanks as always for joining me.
Thanks for being here.
We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Jordan LaPier. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Chris Ramón and myself and produced by Chris Ramón, Yafat Tawahara, and me. Our editor is Yafat Tawahara, and the executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.